Hey readers, this is Liz Davidson from Beyond Solitaire Books, and I'm here with a November and December wrap-up. We just live in interesting times, so I'd actually recorded my my November wrap-up back at the beginning of December. I just never edited it, so I'm going to show you that video, and then I'm going to talk about what I read in December to cap off 2021. So have a quick look at what past Liz thought about the books of November, and then we're going to come back to the books of December. So the first book that I read in November was The 10,000 Doors of January by Alix Harrow. I really thought I was going to like this one because I've heard so much good buzz about it, but it was okay. It was definitely a little bit cliche. There were points where I thought it was a little bit overwritten, and the story was wildly predictable and maybe a little too happy at the end. But it was entertaining enough. There were moments where I was definitely caught up in the drama, and I don't regret reading it. I just don't necessarily think it's a must-read. After that, I read Transmetropolitan, Volume 1, Back on the Street. So this is a series that I read in its entirety back in college, and I absolutely loved it, and I was revisiting it. Then I found out that Warren Ellis is a total creep. The graphic novel is still really good. I may still continue my reread of the rest of them, but I've had to at least take some time off to process how gross I feel about the way that Warren Ellis behaved towards his fans, and I have to decide how that's going to impact my relationship with his work. I think that's a personal decision for everybody, but I was so grossed out that I just needed a minute to think about it. So Transmetropolitan is a series that on its merits I think is fantastic, but be aware that there's some problematic author stuff going on, and if that's something that you're sensitive to, you should know about it. After that, I read Writers and Lovers by Lily King. This is basically a book about a struggling young writer who's trying to get her life together, and she's having a hard time of it. And she also has two potential relationships with men, one of whom is an established author who's kind of love bombing her a little bit, and the other of whom is more age appropriate, but also not as fancy. So watching her find herself and try to find love is charming. It's a good book. I enjoyed it. I wasn't as wild about it as some were, but I think that's because I thought the ending was maybe a little too perfect. Again, this is one of those situations where the protagonist is struggling and struggling and struggling and struggling. And then at the end, it's like she hits pay dirt so big that it's kind of like, really? I don't know about that. But it was an enjoyable read, and I definitely don't regret the time I spent with it at all. I, in fact, think it's a fun one, especially if you want to kind of get into the mindset of somebody who is young, but not super young anymore, struggling with trying to get their career online. I will say that at one point she gets hired as a teacher in this book, and the way that they act about teaching, even in private school teaching, is like ridiculous as a professional teacher. We're just going to let that go. It's fiction. Read it for the fun. Don't take that part too seriously. After that, I read Moneyball, The Art of Winning an Unfair Game by Michaelides. And this is, of course, the book that Moneyball the movie is based on, but it's basically about how by paying attention to statistics in baseball, you can make better decisions about how to build a team than you can if you're just kind of going on instinct or on flair on the field. And I thought this was such a cool read. It was amazing to see how this worked and the pioneers of viewing baseball this way, the resistance to their methods that they got. It's just a really, really cool, in-depth piece of writing that I enjoyed very much, especially as a baseball fan. So I'm really, really glad I read that one. Excellent nonfiction, learned a ton, was engaged the whole time. Excellent. After that, I read a book that was not so excellent, and that was Alix Michaelides' The Silent Patient. I really, really was into it at first, but then as the plot started to come together and it started to kind of hit the ending where the big reveal happens, there was so much just implausible, ridiculous stuff in there that I was super turned off. And I do have this problem with thrillers a lot, but man, this one had me going so good. And then the ending was such a letdown for me. I won't give away what it was, but not for me. And then after that, I read a fascinating book that I did review in full a few weeks ago, so I'll put it down in the show notes. But I read Bear by Marian and Engel, and I read it because, one, I'm prurient, and two, I will give anything that seems like great literature a chance. So this is a Canadian Book Award winner, considered a great piece of Canadian literature. It's about a lonely librarian who goes to an estate to catalog some books, and she has a sexual relationship with a semi-domestic bear. So let's just sit with that for a minute. If that's not your thing, this book will really, really gross you out. It really wasn't my thing, and I had some moments where I felt super uncomfortable reading it. At the same time, it was actually very well written, and I can see why it won a book award. So if you want to see my full review of that, link below. Otherwise, just run if this isn't for you. Unless you're feeling curious, in which case I don't actually regret reading it. So that's not a ton of books for November, but as far as I'm concerned, as long as you're reading and having a good time, you're having a good reading month, and so I did. All right, so thanks to Past Liz for all that insightful analysis of books, and of course November ended on an interesting note with Bear. December began with some good nonfiction reading. I read a book about Genghis Khan. It was called Genghis Khan and the Making of the Modern World, and it was by Jack Weatherford. So this book was not a super in-depth analysis of Genghis Khan and his importance to the world. It was really more of an entertaining, surface-level read, at least in my opinion, but it definitely got me interested in learning more about the subject. And so I may actually be looking up more books about Genghis Khan in order to satisfy my curiosity. He was very interesting and had a lot of interesting ideas about how to rule, how to conquer. And of course, he was sort of an exceptional person whose legacy was picked up by his descendants who were not always as exceptional. And the book covers some of that as well. So quick, interesting read, nothing too fancy. It was a fun one. After that, I finally finished the Daevabad trilogy by reading Empire of Gold by S.A. Chakraborty. So this one was interesting because I did really enjoy it. I thought it was a good ending to a great series. I liked this third book a bit less than I remember liking the other two. And I haven't reread the first two in the trilogy in many years, so I'm not sure where that's coming from. Maybe I've just changed over time. But I thought the third book was solid. I liked that there were real consequences and changes in the characters over time. At the same time, I sometimes felt that their moral perspectives and some of Chakraborty's views about governing and being kind to the people and all of that got a little bit heavy-handed. Like, yes, I realize that you're creating characters who are trying to be good and do the right thing. Got it. I could have dealt with a little more realpolitik myself. But I really enjoyed the book. It was a fun conclusion to a really fun fantasy series. Honestly, it's probably one of the better fantasy trilogies I've read in a really long time. And I definitely recommend that you check it out. It is the Daevabad trilogy. The first book in the series is City of Brass, and I absolutely love that book. Then, because this was clearly fantasy trilogy month, I finally finished the Poppy Word trilogy. I started that thing last year, and then I quit reading it so that I could read in line with other people. It didn't work out, and I just didn't pick the books back up forever. But I finally read The Dragon Republic and The Burning God, which are books 2 and 3 in that Poppy Word trilogy by R.F. Kuang. They were phenomenal. I really, really like this trilogy. It was another one that really did the right things in terms of making the characters lose things and not be able to just have everything they wanted at the end. There's a lot of brutality and struggle and kind of interesting development of characters throughout the last 2 books. And I always worry that things are going to kind of fizzle out by the end. I did not feel that way about this particular trilogy. I will say that once again, and this may just be a me thing, I thought that the third book didn't stick the landing quite as well as I wanted, in the sense that there were parts of that book that dragged. So there were stretches where we spent a little bit too much time in the main character's head, where maybe there were too many long, dragged out descriptions of battles, and they were pretty badass, but they weren't as interesting as the interactions between the characters. I just didn't like them as much. But the ending was amazing, not in the it was happy sort of way, but in the wow, that was a hell of an ending kind of way. And I was really, really happy with how it ended, even though I was also very sad. I just thought it was very fitting and bold as a way to finish things off. This series also had a lot of really cool stuff to say about colonialism and culture, which I actually might get into in a separate video because I thought this was so good. The next thing I read was Remote Control by Nnedi Okorafor, and this was a really interesting kind of sci-fi story of a girl who is considered the adopted daughter of death, but it's actually that she's got a connection to some sort of strange seed that she found beneath a tree in her family's childhood garden. But there are a lot of consequences to the power that this seed has given her, and she's also just a little kid trying to make her way in the world with no family and just no support. And it's a really sad, interesting read. I definitely recommend it for people who want to try something a little different. I don't know if this is the best Nnedi Okorafor book to start with, but I looked and she's got a bunch of other really cool looking books that I think I'm going to try based on this one. After that, I read Hilary Mantel's A Place of Greater Safety. It was okay. I actually had much higher expectations of it based on my extreme love of her Thomas Cromwell trilogy, which starts with Wolf Hall. Just go read those now. If you have not, do it now. Seriously. It's way more important than listening to me or pretty much anything else you could do. A Place of Greater Safety is earlier historical fiction that she wrote that's set during the French Revolution, and it follows a whole bunch of very important people from that time period and their wives and lovers. And it was okay. I really love Hilary Mantel's writing. It was still good. So her descriptions are great. Her personifications of these people, bringing them to life, still great. There were a lot of kind of funky viewpoint changes, and I felt like she was following a whole lot of different storylines in ways that I did not like as much as I liked just the focus from Cromwell's point of view of her later trilogy. So if you like Hilary Mantel, you'll still like this, but it's also definitely earlier work, at least in my opinion. Still worth reading, just not as mind-blowing as I expected, but maybe that's not fair. And then my last book of the year was Napoleon A Life by Andrew Roberts. I just wanted to know more about Napoleon, and I got my wish. This book was actually really good. It really did a good job of depicting Napoleon as a real person, and I think that that is something that often doesn't quite happen when you are reading nonfiction about somebody who is too far back in the past. So it's really clear Napoleon left a lot of really interesting material to work with, as did everybody who knew him. And also that Roberts was dealing with a lot of dishonesty because Napoleon lied a lot, and so did pretty much everyone else of his time period when they were trying to make themselves look good in writing. But despite all of that, I feel like I got a really accurate understanding of Napoleon. He's very affectionate, sometimes very childlike, playful, curious. He and I would have probably enjoyed talking about the classics because he was obsessed with classical history and Julius Caesar. And, you can see that in his choices and his interests and what he called himself when he was the first consul of France. And it also does a good job of kind of fitting him into his world. So getting context on Napoleon as somebody who shows up after the French Revolution, somebody who is interacting with European monarchs, somebody who is kind of trying to create a new world, but also is very attached to the traditions and ideas of the old one. And I ended up being annoyed by him in a lot of ways, as I think a lot of people who knew Napoleon were. But I also felt a lot of sympathy for him. And I think that that is the mark of a very good book. You could see that Napoleon was flawed, that it's probably good that he did not end up with all the power that he wanted in his life, but it's also very clear to see that the man was a genius and also a person of tremendous energy and spirit. So if you want to know more about an allegedly short man who lived an enormous life, this book was a great read. And that was my month of December. So that wraps up 2021. I'm already a few books into 2022 though, and the year's already looking good on the reading front, even though I wish Omicron would go away. So thanks so much for watching. Please like, subscribe, comment. Let me know what you've been reading at the end of this past year. And most of all, happy reading.